It is time to begin the Japan-U.S. Dialogue Public Forum hosted by Genron NPA and supported by Japan Foundation Global Cooperation Center. My name is Nishimura and I'm going to be serving as the MC. Thank you very much for coming. First and foremost, on behalf of Genron NPO, I would like to call upon President Kudo for opening remarks.
皆さんこんにちは。言論 PO の工藤です。
Good afternoon. My name is Kudo of Genron NPO. Thank you very much for coming to the third Japan-U.S. dialogue. Tomorrow, we are going to be starting up the Asia Peace Conference participated by Japan, US, China, and Korea. And this is a pre-event. It took us 6 years to prepare for the upcoming Asia Peace Conference. And tomorrow, with the friends from China, US, and the Republic of Korea, we will be launching a discussion to start a platform. But before that, allies Japan and United States should be discussing how we ought to cooperate in this area. So that is one of the objectives of this dialogue. As you know, in Northeast Asia, DPRK, Taiwan, East China Sea, and other risks exist. And the country's relationship within this region is not necessarily stable. So despite this area being one of the riskiest regions in the world, there is no confidence-building mechanism nor a multilateral framework to think about sustainable peace for the future of this region. So first, we think that we should establish a discussion to create such a mechanism between Japan, US, China, and Korea on behalf of the non-government sector. So this is a historical event. Cooperation between Japan and United States is indispensable in this context. There's another objective to this dialogue. There's US-China tension, and Japan should be contributing to the mitigation of this tension. In the closed meeting this morning, we had a very meaningful discussion. Our interest is what the U.S. has in mind in terms of the ultimate goal of its tension with China. We do understand that there are mixed debates and views in the United States. And there are some Americans who criticize Japan for not being aligned with the United States. Further, in order to establish a reciprocal trading system with more fairness, collaboration with allies is necessary. So action that would weaken the position of allies should not be taken. At any rate, the position taken by Japan is at question. I personally think that the strategic competition between Japan and the US will be prolonged and there would be various upheavals. And we have to increase the deterrence vis-a-vis China, and the exit is reciprocity. In other words, on a level playing field, all countries should be able to compete economically together. There has to be new type of collaboration, and today is a very special timing. Yesterday, January 19th, was the 60th anniversary of the Japan-U.S. Security Pact, and I reread the treaty again. And Article 2 is of a special relevance today when we think about today's context in terms of U.S.-Japan relations. U.S. took the central lead to create democracy that supports a free world and a free system based upon the rule of law. And Article 2 declares that through strengthening such a system, we shall together further contribute to peaceful and friendly international relationship. But nowadays, the attention is paid only to the U.S.-China relationship bilateral ties, and the multilateral framework is becoming uncertain. That is why, all the more so, the two countries should take the lead. and make contributions that would lead to long-term interests of both countries. We will spend the next 3 hours to discuss the U.S.-China issue and Northeast Asia. Our objective is to make the U.S.-Japan relationship even more robust. We truly hope that the audience here shares such desire and stay until the very end. We now would like to begin the third Japan-U.S. dialogue. Thank you. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, the Asia Peace Conference will begin. We have with us former ambassador to China, Ambassador Yuji Miyamoto, who serves as the chair of the prep meeting for tomorrow's conference.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Asia Peace Conference is to be launched tomorrow, and this initiative has been led by Mr. Kudo, the president of Genron NPA, amidst the ever-increasing destabilization in East Asia, and the global environment is increasingly fluid these days, and there is no platform or fora to discuss how to achieve peace in Asia. That has been absent, and Mr. Kudo has been working hard to launch Asia Peace Conference. Obviously, Japan and the United States should take the lead in establishing a forum. The cooperation and dialogue between Japan and the United States has been ever more important, has become ever more important, and we have been trying to enhance this bilateral dialogue at Genron NPO. And thanks to these efforts made over the years, we have come to a stage where we can launch this Asia Peace Conference, which gives me a great pleasure. And what is one of the most important is the cooperation and dialogue between Japan and the United States, and that is why we are having this session. And we have high expectations for this forum, and we are certain that we are confident that we will be able to produce significant results. And I would like to thank everybody for participating in this forum, and I hope that you will continue to support initiatives so that our initiative, though small now, can be expanded more broadly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Miyamoto. Now, without further ado, we would like to start the first session. Now, let me very briefly introduce the panelists. First of all, for Japan-U.S. dialogue, we have speakers from the United States who have been kind enough to come all the way. From Pacific, the Forum, President Emeritus, President Ralph Cossa. Next, seated next to him, is from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Distinguished Fellow, Dr. Douglas Paul. Seated next to him is the President of Economic Strategy Institute, Mr. Clyde Prestowitz. And next is Ambassador David Scheer, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Now, the Japanese panelists. Ambassador Miyamoto, the former Japanese ambassador to China. Next to him is Mr. Hidenishi, the former Administrative Vice Minister of Defense. And seated next to him is Professor Kawai of the University of Tokyo. And Admiral Kawano, the former Chief of Staff of the Joint Staffs. And Admiral Koda, the Vice Admiral of Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, formerly. And Professor Takahara, the Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, and Mr. Kudo, the President of Genron NPO, who will moderate the session. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have two sessions. at the beginning, from Japanese and U.S. side, we would like to have people raise questions, and we will have discussion for 60 minutes. So we should be efficient and effective as much as possible. What we are mostly interested would be the conflict between the U.S. and China becoming more serious, and the global economy that may be cut in half. The decoupling is often talked about. And what would be the goal beyond this situation? And as an ally, Japan, what is expected of us from the United States? We would like to listen to the views of our American friends so that the Japanese side will be able to respond and have a good discussion. Now, from the U.S. side, because we need to have a good frame to be presented, we will have Mr. Clyde Prestowitz to speak for 10 minutes. He's a well-known person at the Japan-U.S. structural talks. He was the chief negotiator. He's no longer an enemy. He's, of course, a good ally and friend for all of us. So I hope that we will have a good frame to be presented from Mr. Prestowitz. Please.
There we go. Yes, I used to be Akume, but now hopefully I can become Yume. As I look around the room, I see some gray hair, and also on the panel. And so I think many of you, like me, lived most of your life in a divided world during the Cold War. We had world divided between the democratic, free trade, free speech countries and the communist, closed system, planned economy system. And during that period, there was little trade between the Soviet Union and Communist China and the democratic countries. Indeed, the policy of the democratic countries was what we called, we were containing them, containment. And consequently, there was little American or European or Japanese investment in Russia. There was no Russian investment in the free world countries. There was some trade, but not very much trade. And of course, there were various wars and skirmishes, and what we called it the Cold War. That ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And of course, there was a great sense of achievement, of happiness, of relief in the democratic countries that finally this difficult period had been ended. And there was a great hope that the world could become one world, and that through trade and investment and what we came to call globalization, we could create a peaceful, prosperous future. Indeed, there was so much positive energy that famous writers wrote books called like The End of History, Frank Fukuyama. Presidents like Clinton and President George H.W. Bush and President George W. Bush spoke of the advance toward global peace and freedom based on international trade and investment. And there were a series of agreements and bilateral undertakings to promote a closer relationship, particularly with China. Finally, in 2001, China was made a member of the World Trade Organization. Corporations from Europe, from Japan, from the United States invested heavily in China. China's exports grew dramatically. The United States went from having a trade deficit of about $50 billion a year with China to something like $400 billion a year in a very short period of time. And then things began not to proceed as had been forecast. There continued to be trade frictions. There continued to be geopolitical frictions. Particularly, there were 2 or 3 developments that have changed in the last year or so that have changed the tone. There was an expectation in the democratic countries that globalization would open China economically, but that it would also open China diplomatically and politically, and that it would lead to peaceful relationships and away from conflict, away from any threat of war. The rapid advance of the internet in the late 1990s, early 2000s, suggested that we would increasingly have one world. And it was generally assumed in the democratic countries that in that one world, there would be freedom of speech, there would be freedom of the press, there would be a rule of law, and that China, while it might not become formally a democracy, would become a more liberalized society. But beginning around 2000, China made a decision to separate its internet from the world internet. It built the Great Firewall, making it difficult, if not impossible, to go into the Chinese internet or for China to go into the global internet. And there were increasing complaints coming from free world companies, corporations invested in China. They told their governments that they found that as a condition of investing in China, they were forced to transfer technology to Chinese competitors, or they were forced to hire certain kinds of people to run their businesses. And they reported that if they objected to this kind of direction, they would be subjected to sudden inspections, the health inspection, or their electricity would be cut off, or their water would be stopped. And these were not formal directions, but they happened. And then that led to further negotiations and directions from higher authorities to cooperate in the Chinese way. And so over a period of time, the expectation of a globalized society, a globalized economy, became increasingly into question. And finally, in March of 2018, The Economist magazine carried a cover story, the title of which was "The West Made the Wrong Bet." In other words, The Economist was saying that the idea that globalization was going to democratize and liberalize China was wrong. And at the same time, China had earlier begun to promote government backing and developmental support for targeted industries. So electronics, artificial intelligence, robotics, aviation. All of these became government-directed, subsidized, led industries, which increasingly suggested that there would not be market competition between the companies of democratic countries and the corporations of China. Moreover, it had been expected that China's state-owned enterprises would diminish in importance in the Chinese economy, but in fact, they grew in importance in the Chinese economy. And so increasingly there was conflict, friction economically, and at the same time, China rapidly built up its military forces, particularly in the South China Sea. It began to harass fishermen in the South China Sea. It began to harass, as you well know, the Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan. And so both the economic frictions and the geopolitical frictions led to increasing doubt and led to the cover story of The Economist magazine, and have formed the environment in which we now meet as we discuss how we should be trying to deal with China in a way that, on the one hand, does not result in war, but on the other hand, allows us to maintain healthy economic development in our own economies. The most recent set of negotiations, of course, has been the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China, in which last week an agreement was reached. But my own view, and I think that of most experts I know, is that that's a nice agreement, but it's not going to solve the problem. In any case, what all of this new world division suggests is that U.S. and its allies need to discuss deeply and carefully how they need to cooperate and integrate their efforts economically, geopolitically, and diplomatically in dealing with China. And so with that, let me open to the next speaker and hope that we have a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
プレスウィッツさんには後からもうちょっと
Mr. Clyde Prestowitz, I will ask you to give us deeper insight later. So, U.S. has bit wrongly, and under China as of today, it can no longer collaborate. In a way, it's a competitive, strategic competition. Major current to exclude China has already begun. Now, I would like to ask Professor Kawai and Mr. Nishi each to comment 5 minutes. Could we start with Professor Kawai? Yes. Or whoever would like to go first, then Nishi-san. Thank you. For some time, I had been engaged in the defense world and military world. China is a different country and different world. That has always been the major presumption. The concept of strategy is completely different, and national land or sovereignty concept is completely different. The West tried to build this conceptual framework of international community, which is unacceptable to China. So dialogue in security is very difficult with such a partner, and it was already in the late 1990s that we began to talk like that at the Ministry of Defense, but no one rendered their ears. And in 2015, when we revised the U.S.-Japan Defense Cooperation Guideline, the United States was still trying to avoid mentioning China directly because that would lead to significant exacerbation of Sino-U.S. relations. Then, a new U.S. officer said, why didn't you put in China at the time of the guideline revisions in 2015? They criticized, so we rebutted by saying, you're the ones that didn't want to mention China, and they were shocked that that was the attitude of their predecessor. But from the military strategic viewpoint, Japan falls right in between the West and China. We've been looking at both sides. So I think Japan has been actually feeling intuitively the big difference in the positions. Kazumi Takahashi, who died 40 years ago, who was active in the 70s in the humanities faculty of Kyoto University. When he was young, he was a genius. When we see the conflict between the West and China, Japan will be able to stand in between at the middle. That was his last words. That's my personal message today. If things go unchanged, then there's going to be a big flashpoint between United States and China. And if we are to find a pathway of exit, then it's Japan who has the intelligence to create such pathway. But how can Japan persuade both the United States and China? I think that's a very complicated task. But at any rate, Japan is in between United States and China, so we will be in a position to try to promote dialogue. So that's one step necessary. But at the same time, there's another thing that's necessary. For Japan, United States is the only ally. So what if coordination fails between the two allies? Then we have to have a backup plan. So those are the things, two things that we need to do. From such perspective, I'm probably towards the pessimist grouping within this panel. Even if tentatively there is an agreement between China and America, it won't be long-lived. After World War II and peace treaty was established, a general of France said it's not a peace treaty, it's just a truce that will last only for 20 years, and then there will be yet another war in 20 years' time. There was a general who said that. That's very close to what I feel. It's just a matter of how long it will survive.
西さん、今の話で
Mr. Nishi, just one comment on what you have just said. Japan that has to deal with the China because the China is a neighbor, so we knew all sorts of things. But U.S. Didn't know all of these. But at last, is it because that the U.S. at last understands what China stands for? Or is it because the U.S. thinks that it has done too much? Because the U.S. was too late in coming to the understanding of the reality. During the Cold Wars, the China today is very different from the USSR in those days, because USSR was totally separate from the Western democratic economies. But China is right in the midst of the global economy, and it is right in the midst and at the center of the highly complicated the world today. So what happens and goes wrong in China, that would mean the whole global society may disintegrate. So how should we deal with this paradox? Nobody has the answer yet, is my take. Then Professor Kawai, please. I'm from University of Tokyo. I'm with the Graduate School of Public Policy. Now, I specialize in economics. So, how should the U.S. deal with China going forward? And what should be the role to be played by Japan is the focus of my attention in my presentation. Now, thinking about the world's GDP 50 years from now, if we try to predict the Chinese economy, it would be growing continuously in many ways. In the year 2030, or in the 2030s, the Chinese economy, in terms of GDP, will surpass the U.S. economy. There is a high probability of that happening. And Chinese economy would be the biggest economy in the world. It does not mean that China will have the hegemony. I don't think that would be the case. The reason why I say this is because the U.S. economy and the EU economy will continue to grow as well. And the U.S. GDP and the EU GDP taken together, even after 50 years from now, would be bigger than Chinese economy, continue to be bigger. And if you even add Russia to China, the story would be the same. And if you also add Japan to US and EU, then the GDP would be far bigger. And China continues to have aging society, and then the Indian economy will become bigger. Indian economy will come closer to the magnitude of Chinese economy eventually. So I may sound rather naive, but from economists' point of view, for the security of the United States, what would be most important it would be to work in close partnership with the European Union and also to have strong partnership with Japan, the so-called like-minded countries. Australia, Canada should also be made closer to the United States because the United States alone, economically speaking, may be beaten by China. But if U.S. can work with the other countries, then U.S. will never ever be beaten. Now, what President Trump is putting forward as America first or America alone as a policy is something very mistaken, as I think. Now, earlier, decoupling was mentioned. President Trump and President Xi Jinping, in the first phase, they have come to agreement. The agricultural produce and energy and manufactured goods, United States is trying to massively increase, about $200 billion of increase in export to China. This is towards the opposite direction of decoupling, I believe. U.S. is thinking that it could put forward itself as a hostage to China because when a crisis happens again, China may stop the import. So the American farmers, they may be in trouble. The American manufacturers may be in trouble. But even so, President Trump is trying to advance towards completely opposite direction. Now, on the technology front, the question of Huawei and also other products and services to be closed out from the U.S. market, that as a policy would continue. But apart from that, I believe interdependence may increase between U.S. and China. So in the first stage agreement, China will open up its financial market. So the U.S. financial institutions will make big inroads into Chinese domestic market. And as Chinese domestic market grows, for not only for the Japanese companies, but for the U.S. companies as well, it will be very attractive and lucrative at the market, it seems. So, from economic point of view, I don't think we can underestimate what is happening right now. China, in the world today, I don't think China will ever be able to obtain the hegemony because US and EU will continue to be close and Japan will support this partnership, meaning that for United States and also for Japan, this would be quite beneficial because China will never ever be able to gain hegemony. But in the process of that, China itself must turn towards market economy, and we should approach and urge and encourage China to do so. And that, I believe, is a role to be played by US, EU, and Japan through reform of the WTO and also through the FOIP initiative. We should try to engage China. And within RCEP, we have the trilateral Japan, China, Korea, the ROK. FTA will be substantially included, but it should be expanded as an RCEP. So to a higher level, more ambitious agreement needs to be aimed for to try to urge China to turn towards a market economy and to have SOE reform to be advanced. We should urge China to do that. The subsidies policy must be changed. We should ask China to try to take responsible policies to try to not to ask for forced transfer of intellectual properties and other technologies. And that should be included in the second stage of the U.S.-China trade negotiation. And Japan should work with the United States and the European Union to try to forge through the WTO reform in this regard. Thank you.
ちょっとこれからアメリカの人に
Thank you very much. Maybe I should invite our American colleagues to speak. But again, Mr. Priskovitz, I think you didn't have enough time, so let me ask you this question. Mr. Kawai was saying that China is unlikely to change. So if we exert pressure on China, they will just exclude us. But according to Mr. Kawai, what Trump is doing is trade negotiations with China. And this might couple the United States and China. The interdependency will be increased rather than decreased as a result of coupling the two economies. The United States has changed its policy, and the ally, Japan. What is the view of the United States towards Japan? Do you think, do the Americans believe that Japan is aligned in terms of its directions with the United States? Please use the microphone.
I think Americans generally are uncertain about Japan. When we read the Japanese press, we see that the dispute between the trade friction, let's say, between the U.S. and China is described as an American problem. We see that the commentators talk about Trump's trade war. And it seems in some ways that Japanese analysts don't see that Japan is included or is involved. And of course, there is very significant trade and investment between China and Japan. So I think there's a question mark in the U.S. in the mind of the public, and particularly, let's say, the foreign affairs community. I think there's a question mark about to what extent is Japan committed to the U.S.-Japan security alliance, and how far will Japan be willing to go? Let me suggest a couple of examples. We know that there has been increased friction in the South China Sea and, of course, around the Senkaku Islands. I think U.S. analysts feel strongly that there needs to be a much tighter coordination between U.S. forces and Japanese forces, and a mutual expansion of those forces. But it's unclear to many American observers as to how far Japan is willing or able to go. Now, on the one hand, Abe-san has done quite a lot. I can see that in dealing with the Philippines and Vietnam and India. But on the other hand, there is not a clear definition of the future collaboration of the U.S. and Japan. And I don't think this is entirely an issue for Japan. It's also an issue for the United States. But in any case, I think it remains an area that needs to be more fully addressed. Second point, and I think this is a very important point, is that as earlier speakers have said, the Chinese concept of the relationship between the government and corporations, between the government and people, is just very different. And we talk about state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. But there's not a great difference in China. A private enterprise in China is still has a Communist Party organization within it. And the Communist Party organization within a so-called private enterprise must review the issues and decisions of the board of directors. You take Alibaba. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, recently retired. Why did he retire? Many of my Chinese friends say because he's getting too much publicity, more than Xi Jinping. So safer for him to retire. But Jack has said himself, if the government needs my company, I'll give it to them. I cannot imagine that Tim Cook, the chairman of Apple, would say that he would give his company to the American government. So when we talk about changing China, I wonder if we know what we're talking about. Those kinds of concepts are so foreign and so different. It seems to me that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to negotiate some kind of a change. And therefore, I feel that rather than trying to change China, we need to change ourselves. And we, U.S., Japan, need to think carefully about not just our mutual security arrangement, but security is not just military. Security is economic, it's scientific, and all of those areas need to be reviewed very carefully for closer U.S.-Japan collaboration.
はい、ありがとうございました。今日はアメリカから
Thank you very much. From the U.S. set aside, besides Mr. Prestowitz, we have experts from the military as well as from foreign policy point of view. Do you agree with Mr. Prestowitz? Or does Mr. Prestowitz have completely different opinion from the other Americans? Ambassador Xie, please, if you could start.
Thank you very much. I think the American national security community has more confidence in Japan's commitment to the alliance, and I think a number of indications of that, or in support of that, I would look at Prime Minister Abe's effort to pick up the slack that America has left off in the region since the Trump administration came in. Prime Minister Abe has basically saved the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it's my hope that the United States one day decides to rejoin that organization. He has pursued an extremely vigorous diplomacy toward the region, particularly towards Southeast Asia, visiting the 10 ASEAN countries within a very short time of his assumption of his duties as Prime Minister. And he has continued that forward-leaning approach toward the region throughout his tenure. Japan has very strongly worked to network with like-minded countries, not just the United States, but with Australia, Vietnam, and India as well, for example. And I think it's important that we all work closely, like-minded countries work closely together to balance China and to manage diplomacy related to China. The Prime Minister has also used military forces in the region very deftly, increasing self-defense force, particularly maritime self-defense force operations in the South China Sea, and cooperating closely with the U.S. Navy there, as well as using the Japanese Coast Guard to fend off Chinese efforts to extend its administration over the Senkakus. So meanwhile, while Prime Minister Abe has worked very hard to increase Japan's own profile in the region, he's worked very hard to strengthen the alliance. And that was evident even before the Trump administration came in the issuance of the new National Defense Program guidelines and the new U.S.-Japan defense guidelines in 2015. So as a member of the national security community, I'm conscious of Japan's efforts to hedge. I'm conscious of the Prime Minister's efforts to adjust Japan's relations with China, given the increased uncertainty in the region. But I'm also confident of Japan's commitment to the alliance and of its willingness to do what we need to do to balance China.
はい、いろいろ褒めて
Thank you for those compliments. It's flattering. Now, Douglas Paul, the position of the United States vis-a-vis China, Mr. Prestowitz was very clear on his thoughts. Douglas, do you agree with him? And how do you see Japan's role?
Is this working? Thank you. Well, I'm happy to say that I agree in part with Mr. Prestowitz, and I disagree in some parts as well. Also agree with Kawai Sensei and his efforts to get to ground truth on what the realities are in China. Where I would disagree with Clyde Prestowitz is on the characterization of private firms versus state-owned enterprises in China. There are unusual characteristics of private firms operating in China for reasons of they are forced to deal with the Communist Party structure. But there are also strong differences between state enterprises and private enterprises. If you're looking for a serious issue of division within Chinese domestic politics, interference in the private sector is one of them. And economists, I think Prestowitz would agree, can see that state-owned enterprises' return of value on investment has been significantly less than the private sector. And this has been the strong argument of the private sector, that they should be given the same, or at least fair access to credit in competition with the state-owned enterprises that get privileged access to credit. It's a problem that hasn't been resolved. It's a real problem. It's one we have to face. And that's really the message I want to deliver in these few moments, which is a continuation of Kawai Sensei's remarks as well, which is we have to deal with China as it is, not as we wish it would be. There may be hopes we have for the long run, but if we want to have productive cooperation between Japan and the United States, we've got to find realistic areas for that cooperation to take place. The first admonition I would give is that for 500 years, foreigners have tried to change China and have been very unsuccessful. Japan's got a rich history in doing that. The missionaries from Europe in the 15th century, 16th century, and after Americans trying to deal with Chiang Kai-shek, we've had a lot of failures in attempting to change China from within. But we also recognize that the Chinese Communist Party system is one that rules through power. It does not get its power through rules. And China pushes until it reaches resistance, and then it backs off if it can't make pressure work. There lies the key for cooperation between the US and Japan and other parties in the region. That when China pushes the rules, pushes too far, South China Sea is an example where we miss the opportunity to push back. We have scope for action to limit the behavior of China, if not change the system of China. Thank you.
じゃあ続いてラルフ・コストさんお願いします。
Well, thank you. I'm more inclined to agree with David than Clyde as regarding Japan's reliability as an ally. I think there is more apprehension in Japan about U.S. reliability than there is in America about Japanese reliability. But I note that while the two of them described the problem completely differently, they both had the same solution, which was that the U.S. and Japan need to cooperate together. We need to coordinate and collaborate and get our own acts together and work in unison in order to deal with China, which I think is the message that every one of our speakers has been given. So I think that we may have approached the problem differently, but we've all reached the same conclusion, and it's the right conclusion. and that's that the alliance is critical. It's critical to managing the rise of China and to providing, not to contain China, but to sort of restrain its options, and that's what we need to be doing. I think it's also important to understand that there's been a dramatic change in China. I've argued that the most significant event of the last decade was the death of Deng Xiaoping thought in China. That the guiding principles and the principles under which we engage China to bring them into the WTO and other agreements were all based on a philosophy that Deng Xiaoping had laid out, which essentially lived beyond him through his chosen successors, but failed once the next generation, led by Xi Jinping, came to power. And we need to understand that, and need to understand that the China that we're dealing with today is not just a stronger China, but a China that's following a different roadmap. And we need to try to do what we can to get it back onto the original roadmap, which was one of greater cooperation. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。じゃあ、
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Prestowitz, do you have a comment, please?
I want to make things maybe a little more concrete and maybe a little more debatable. So I think the three of us agree. All four of us agree that we do think that Japan is doing a substantial job. We think that the collaboration between Japan and the U.S. is essential. We all agree that the Trump administration has handled things in a clumsy manner. But there is, I think the point where maybe we fall apart is that, and this is very blunt, but Japan spends 1% of GDP on defense. The U.S. spends about 3%. So, you know, if I'm a U.S. official, yes, I appreciate what Japan is doing, but it doesn't seem to be as committed when it comes to putting down the money. Japan doesn't seem to be putting its money where its mouth is. And I'm sorry if that sounds impolite, but I think that is the crux of the matter.
わかりました。今、アメリカの
Thank you. Based upon what our U.S. friends have said, Takara-san, sorry, General Koda and Professor Takara, you're two very busy gentlemen, so you two in that order, please. I'm so honored that I was mistaken for Professor Takahara, but to simplify what's been said, what role is Japan to play? First of all, once again, Japan needs to be reminded of the following point. I talked about this in December at the Tokyo-Beijing Forum. U.S.-China trade conflict as we see it today cannot be described as lightly as Sino-U.S. economic Cold War. They're using economy as a tool for U.S. and China to fight a hot war. In terms of military force, U.S. and China are in Cold War status. The reason I say so is because the leadership in a few decades, which will have the leadership, it's not possible to wage real war, so they use economy and high tech to fight against each other to take control. And that started last year in July. And I think that's the kind of way we need to look at the situation. The fourth elevation of tariff through sanctions by the United States. So that's the context in which we have to see the sanctions. And then finally, we see phase 1 of trade agreement, but it's not going to lead to economic reform, and the agreement has no relevance whatsoever to cause reform or economic reform. So they just agreed upon things that would not cause pain to either. It's just the superficial point. I don't think it's going to survive for even 20 years. It's just a soft patch or pause because the essential fundamental hasn't been improved, and the negotiations in the second round will take place only after the presidential election. And then at that stage, if he's reelected, he has nothing to worry about. Until November, we can foresee how the economic relationship would be. And after that, there could be a full-fledged economic war between the two countries. In other words, each are seeking ultimate leadership, and this is a battle over ultimate leadership. So in this context, what can Japan do? The 4 U.S. friends are right. You're right, but it's difficult to talk about this before Professor Kawai and Kei Danren. I'm writing a paper. I may sound too optimistic, but what about Japan's economic policy vis-a-vis China? If our ally U.S. is fighting a full-fledged economic war, aren't we too light-handed vis-a-vis China when our friend is fighting? Shouldn't we be supportive of our friend? 2 years ago, or was it 2 years ago? 51 items were agreed when Prime Minister visited China, and away from BRI, each project will be tested and provide support. So superficially, it's been cut off from the Belt and Road Initiative. But this, in essence, is Japan contributing to the BRA, while our friend the United States is fighting with China economically. And in that scenario, maybe Japan is supporting our friend's adversary by injecting money into China. I have no intention to say stop everything, to stop all the support, but we have to be more vigilant. We have to measure what the impact would be in terms of the U.S. and Japan relationship when we think about Japan-China relationship, trade relationship, because one mistaken step may destroy U.S.'s position vis-a-vis China. This is an economic fight. And in terms of security, Japan and U.S. will be aligned, no doubt about that. And what Abe is doing diplomatically is correct, as our U.S. friends have commented. But the problem is, in the economic war between China and the United States, is Japan being able to do proper China policy, or are we being able to implement the right China policy? I think that's to be tested. Thank you.
Professor Takahara, please take the floor. Admiral Koda, with my deepest reverence to you, allow me to approach this issue from a different angle. As Admiral has said, this is a long-term war or struggle for hegemony that the United States is waging on China, and it seems that the United States is determined to win this war for hegemony. But the way to fight the war is not necessarily simple. As Dr. Kawai mentioned earlier on, through this round of agreement, the U.S.-China economic exchanges are to be promoted through this first round of agreement that we now have in place. So we should not simplify the structure. It's not black or white. If Japan assumes that this is something black or white, it will inconvenience Japan, and Japan will force to take unrealistic, unpragmatic approach to the whole situation. Between the United States and Japan, we have a difference in terms of the geographical proximity to China, but no one would disagree that Japan should further strengthen ties with the United States while working with China to develop bilateral relations as well. So if the United States is to become entangled in the war for black or white, then not just Japan, but the entire world will be very much inconvenienced by that kind of confrontation between between the United States and China. Having said that, the one important point is that, as some have mentioned, the question is whether China will change or not. Is there any prospect for China to change? That is a key question that we need to look at. As Professor Dr. Kosa mentioned, China is in the process of transformation, but only to the worse. And we see more controls in China, and Chinese behavior in the seas have intensified. That is a situation that we witness. And the Chinese people themselves are feeling a problem with this strengthened control in China. Some Chinese people say that we are in West Korea. Why is that we have a stronger control in China? I would say the Chinese society is changing in a very deep way, and it seems that the Communist Party of China is concerned and fearful about this change that is taking place deep in its society. So the Chinese society is not it's changing. However, the pace of change is not as fast as we want, and there could be a reversal current going forward. So while China is in the process of change, during this process, how to keep peace while China is in the process of change, that I believe is the key issue. And in order to maintain and safeguard peace while China is changing, deterrence and cooperation both will be needed. Through cooperation, we could gain benefits. Use the words of Professor Yokibe, Japan-U.S. alliance and Japan-China cooperation both will have to be achieved. And this is a delicate situation that Japan should manage, including security issues. Thank you.
ちょっと
Now, Admiral Kawano, would you like to jump in? Admiral Koda has made strong remarks. So he was rather conspicuous, but Admiral Kawano, could you explain more? Perhaps you can elaborate. Is the microphone on? Is it working? Now, the theme is, what is the position of Japan vis-a-vis U.S.-China confrontation? Simplistically, Japan should always side with the United States if U.S. is to confront China. Now, what may be the perception vis-a-vis China? Let me share with you my own experience. In 2010, I have assumed the helm at the Self-Defense Force, and it was General Dempsey on the U.S. side as my counterpart, and we had strategic dialogue. What he said is the number one threat to U.S. is Russia. And I forgot the sequence, but China was not second, but I believe it was the third or the fourth in terms of threat to U.S. But in autumn of 2015, when the process started to nominate the next the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, and Admiral Dunford was chosen, and he also said that the number one threat to U.S. is Russia, and China came third or fourth. So I listened to this, and it is not that we had any opinion survey in Japan, but for Japanese self-defense force, the biggest, for the short term it is North Korea, but in the longer term, the number one threat is China, because the China was making extrusions and intrusions into the ocean. So in maintaining Japan-U.S. alliance, the sequence and the ranking of the threat is not really the same for U.S. and Japan. That was not good, was my thought. Now, the new the security, the policy was put forward under the Trump government, and with the national security strategy was put forward, and the defense strategy was also put forward, and now the number one threat has become China. So now we were in alignment, Japan and US, in terms of perception of threat. It is not that we have always been in alignment, but only very recently we have come to agreement that China is number one. So that is one point I would like to mention. And Deng Xiaoping, there was the person instrumental in China to seek economic development, but also what was done is to go into the ocean, to have expedition into the ocean, to try to increase the capability of the Navy, Chinese Navy. And that is at the very origin and source of the friction between Japan and China today. So, because of this intrusion into the ocean by China, that has led to more friction between Japan and China. What is noteworthy is Hong Kong, Taiwan. When we look at these two territories, Taiwan have come up with a bill, a new law to try to criticize mainland China. What about human rights? The regime of China itself, where Communist Party is in one monopoly, and this is something that could not be avoided, that the human rights question is something intrinsic to this one-party monopoly regime. And this, I believe, is the reason of the complication when we look at the conflict between US and China. So the basic point is Japan is a maritime nation, is thinking that the U.S. will always be the number one ally for us because U.S. is also a big maritime power. So, Ambassador Miyamoto, do you have any reaction?
日米同盟ですから、
Of course, we have the alliance with the United States. We should be on their side. But what's U.S. asking us to do? National Defense Authorization Act and Huawei being on the list of embargo. And I think it's still during the public comment period, but in the end, that may apply not just to government procurement, but to private sector transactions or banning Japan's re-export. Then, that would be a big test for Japan in terms of how we cooperate with the United States. It hasn't gone that far, but I think there's a change in perception as such. So, in this context, what kind of response should Japan take? Of course, we have the alliance. We should be on their side. But how do we need to think about this? In the next session, I will be making a fuller comment, but there's now a pillar between Japan and China for security. But when it comes to security, it has to be Japan-U.S. cooperation. That's the only way of survival. That's the only option for Japan to survive if it wants to survive. The structural confrontation between U.S. and China is different from us tolerating the clash between U.S. and China. U.S. and China for some time, Japan, after being identified as a threat, has been under pressure by the United States for 20 years. So we cannot assume, because of the characteristics of America, that they would become lighter or mitigate their pressure on China. So they see China as a threat, so they have to inject a maximum of pressure in order to control. So I think we should assume that this pressure will be prolonged, but we shouldn't tolerate a clash. We don't want economic clash, let alone military clash. So the only remaining option for Japan is, in the midst of this continuing conflict, how can we avoid clash? That's where we can play a role. It's not an easy one, but with both of them, if we converse very thoroughly and sincerely, then we may be able to identify where the causes of misinterpretation and misjudgment, and then we can entice attention to both the US and China. So that kind of wisdom may be supplied by Japan to avoid clash. And to a certain extent, I think Japan can play a role. I still think so, although I do hear voices that I'm overly optimistic. But personally, I think that's still possible.
Thank you very much for your comment. Let me turn to our American friends. When we look at this issue, the confrontation between the United States and China, we tend to focus on this issue as a battle issue. But in order for the United States to prevail, the United States will have to place importance on alliances and international systems which have been built by the United States. Since the United States, which has built the international system, these international systems and frameworks will have to be safeguarded, and that should be leveraged. Those activities should be leveraged to confront China in view of the long-term benefit interests of the United States. As I said at the outset, Article 2 of Alliance Agreement says that the Japan-U.S. alliance is there to safeguard liberal democracy and to develop and grow liberal democracies. And the agreement is there for that purpose, and this satisfies the interests of both countries and will benefit the world of freedom, liberalism, and multilateralism, the system that has been built by the United States over the years. But when we look at the current situation, if you look at the trade structure of Japan, although the United States is important, still China is also important for the Japanese trade. Cooperation in technology, on technology fronts, to come up with there could be a positive development we should be focusing on. Harassing allies may not serve the long-term interests of the United States. What will be your response to that? David, maybe could please give us your take?
要するに同盟関
Alliance. Maybe the Americans should not bully the allies because bullying allies may not serve the long-term interests of the United States, some say. What would be your reaction to those views?
Agree with Kudo-san on the importance of alliances. We tend to think of alliances, we often think of alliances as primarily military and security arrangements, but they go well beyond that. The military and security aspect of our alliance with Japan is fundamentally important, but the alliance also gives the United States and Japan greatly increased leverage throughout the region. And in a situation in which we're competing with China, in which war is unlikely, then diplomacy takes command. We're in a diplomatic game in East Asia with vis-a-vis China, with our allies and like-minded partners, and nothing is more important for a diplomatic game than the generation of leverage, the generation of mass vis-a-vis China in whatever it is we want China to do. So I'm very much in line with Kudo-san on the importance of alliances, and I believe it's a mistake for a grievous mistake for President Trump to question the importance of our alliances. I think there is always room for our allies to do more. I agree with Clyde that Japan should increase its defense spending. I believe that Japan should increase its military capabilities and further loosen restrictions on its use of military force. And I believe the U.S. and Japan should cooperate more closely militarily as normal military allies. I think this alliance is experiencing a moderate crisis due to the president's unpredictability, but we've survived crises before. This is an extremely resilient alliance. We experienced a crisis 60 years ago at the time we concluded it. with massive anti-alliance demonstrations throughout Japan. And I think we can survive the current uncertainties generated by the Trump administration. But it will take commitment among the elites and the national security and economic elites on both sides to weather this storm.
今の話、私の問いかけで他の方
I would ask the same question to others. Mr. Prestowitz, you're the one that started this conversation. Would you like to make a comment?
Thank you. So, I think we all agree on the fundamental importance of alliance. We have, of course, some debate about extent of budgeting and so forth. But I think we need to think to another step, maybe two more steps. One is that, on the one hand, both countries can be making a greater effort to collaborate and to jointly develop and strengthen the alliance. Now, at the same time, however, both of our countries have a significant economic dependence on China. And if the economic dependence on China continues to grow, and particularly if it continues to grow relatively faster than our own bilateral economic interreliance, then even with a strengthened military and diplomatic alliance, there's going to be a counterforce. The Chinese are going to know of our economic dependence, and they are masters at using their coordinated power to offset our efforts. So that suggests maybe we should jointly be discussing. I mean, as you know, the U.S. is trying to prevent many countries from acquiring Huawei 5G technology. Japan is with the U.S. on this issue. But maybe we should be thinking about that more broadly. Semiconductors is a big, important industry. And Japan is a big semiconductor and semiconductor equipment and semiconductor component manufacturing. The U.S., as you know, has been restricting sale of certain semiconductors to China. Should Japan be considering the same kind of question, the same kind of possible restriction? And then, if you take it even to another step, China is, I mean, I have to admire the Chinese from one perspective. The Belt and Road Initiative is a bit of genius. It is enabling China to extend its influence in an apparently very positive way in many parts of the world. However, interestingly, the Belt and Road, of course, takes money. China has to lend a lot of money. And when China began the Belt and Road, it had a 5% of GDP current account surplus, and it had a 38% national savings rate. Well, its savings rate has declined, and its trade surplus is down to about 1.5%. Now, China has just opened its financial markets for outside financial advisors. So American Wall Street companies like Goldman Sachs are just rushing to China to become advisors to Chinese investment funds. The MSCI index has increased the Chinese weighting. And what that means is that more democratic country money is going to be invested in Chinese funds. That is going to help China continue to finance Belt and Road. So should we be thinking about restricting Japanese and U.S. and European financial institutions in managing Chinese funds or in encouraging investment in Chinese funds? Interestingly, for example, the Chinese SOEs, which are big players in the funds management business do not meet the accounting requirements of the New York Stock Exchange. They don't open their books. Nobody really knows what the Chinese balance sheet looks like of all these companies. So should we apply to Chinese investment management, let's say to Japanese and American managers trying to invest Chinese funds, should we apply to them the same requirements that we apply to them when they manage funds in Japan and in the United States? And should we do that as a joint effort? I raise those as, I think, significant questions.
はい、あと
We only have 10 at maximum minutes. Mr. Pa and Mr. Costa, just a word. The confrontation between the United States and China and approach taken by the United States against China, how should Japan position itself amidst this confrontation between the United States and China? To close this session, please, each of you.
My view is that I think it's repetitive, the statement of what others have said, is that we need to identify roles that are respectively our strengths to cooperate together. And particularly, we haven't discussed this part. China is surrounded by 14 land neighbors, none of whom really want to be dependent or allied to China. And none of them really want to be part of an American NATO either. But there's room for cooperation with each of them on their own terms to help them maintain their independence and resilience under Chinese pressure. And we know Chinese pressure will come on each of them. There's a long agenda of doing so. And there will be a natural affinity for those countries to seek friendship and cooperation with outside powers who do not themselves threaten those countries. So adopting a friendly, supportive role between the U.S. and Japan and others, as appropriate, India and South Asia, places like that, we can target resources and policy coordination to help those countries retain their independence and integrity next door to China, so that the Chinese efforts to create an empire or a broader, bigger sphere of influence will be significantly attenuated or reduced. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me make 4 quick points. First, on General Dunford's remarks, which have caused a lot of confusion. He was asked, what is the greatest existential threat to the United States? The answer then was Russia. The answer today is Russia. The answer 5 years or 10 years from now will continue to be Russia. The key word, existential. China poses a great threat to the United States. It challenges U.S. primacy in Asia. It is not an existential threat. By the way, the U.S. is the only existential threat to Russia as well. So we sort of have a balance there. So there's a difference in emphasis, and depending on how you use the word threat, you get different answers. In my own personal view, China is not the greatest threat to U.S. primacy in Asia. That's actually coming today from Washington. But China is a close second, and I think we need to get our policies right and then combine with China. Secondly, alliances. There are 4 major documents produced by the Trump administration regarding Asia. The first is a national security strategy. Second is the national defense strategy. The third was the Pentagon's Indo-Pacific strategy. And the fourth, just released about 2 months ago, was the State Department's Indo-Pacific strategy about the shared vision. The one thing that all 4 have in common is they talk about the U.S. alliances as the foundation for U.S. security policy in Asia. If you go back through the last 8 administrations, you'll find the same exact words. There's great continuity there. What confuses us, what annoys us, what upsets us, is tweets from the President of the United States. The President was asked, how did yesterday you call Xi Jinping your greatest friend and today you called him your enemy? What was the President's response? That's my negotiating style and it works for me. Folks, things are going to get worse. As we start talking about host nation support, you're going to see all sorts of tweets that are going to raise questions to the alliance. But the basic fundamental strategy of the United States as laid out by our documents understands the importance, and the Congress understands the importance, and you've seen legislation already that underscore that. Economic dependence. If Japan is 20% dependent on China for its trade, that means it's 80% not dependent on China. This dilemma about, well, we're dependent on China for economics and America for security is a false choice, a false dilemma. First of all, how much of Japan's trade with China is actually with Japanese multinationals in China? And how much of that 10 years from now will be in Bangladesh or somewhere else? What percentage of your defense is relying on China, on the United States? It's a great deal more, which leads to the last question about what should Japan position itself. It should, A, not overreact to presidential tweets, B, continue to work strongly on the alliance, 3, find a way to reach an accommodation with Korea, because U.S., Korea, Japan coordination is essential to deal with China, and then have faith both in the U.S. and itself. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございました。あと4分あるんです。
Thank you. 4 minutes left. So, Professor Kawai and Mr. Nishi, and one word? And then Kawai-san, Nishi-san, and that's the end. Mr. Ralph Cost, you mentioned Mr. Dunford, General Dunford. That was a misinterpretation of the Japanese press. In Japan, they presented Russia as a general notion, and see, U.S. is not even looking at China as a threat, they said to Prime Minister Abe. So you don't have to be hard-lined. That was the overwhelming reporting by American journalists who weren't doing their homework. They would have understood if they were watching the United States. I don't know whether they were intentionally writing what they knew wasn't right. Professionals understand, but when it goes into the general public, that caused a problem. So that was just a sideline information. Thank you.
Dr. Kawai and Dr. Nishi. Well, distrust against Japan was expressed by our colleagues from the United States. At least from the economic perspectives, Japan has some distrust towards the United States because the United States pulled out from TPP. I mean, TPP, let's face it, was a framework against China. And through Japan-U.S. Trade negotiations, tariffs for automobiles could have been raised. This was a threat. So it was like a gun put to your head while trying to negotiate a solution with the United States. So that was the situation we found ourselves in. And towards the end of last year, there was a series of ASEAN-related conferences, and neither Trump nor Pompeo participated in these conferences. So they seem to take lightly the diplomacy that is taking place in East Asia. So that is a kind of distrust that we've had in Japan. We have in Japan. There are so many shared values between Japan and the United States. We see a lot of common ground. So mutual distrust. We have to admit to ourselves that we have a mutual distrust, and it is a good thing that we admit that there are distrusts, and we work hard as much as possible to minimize this distrust and fill the gap. It's a very good thing that we have a candid discussion.
The post-war system that has been created by the very generous U.S. and U.K., but you no longer have those countries now we have a very divided the world today. And how can Japan play a role, and how can we share a position with the other countries? From the U.S. point of view, Japan has not had to respond to any question of what would you like to do? And there seems to be the dissatisfaction of the U.S. Maybe we need to speak up. Maybe we need to make a clear statement. But because we haven't done that for the 7 decades in the post-war period, we have not yet made clear what is our world view, our view of the world. We should make it clear. So the challenge for U.S. is that we have been too inward-looking. We should be more disciplined and make our message more clear.
ただ
We spent 1 hour during this discussion, and I think we were able to cover much ground in terms of conflict and U.S.-Japan cooperation as well. I think we now have many food for thought. And yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. And I think we need to foster an environment where candid exchange of view is possible. So it's good that we had this discussion. And in the next session, we want to specifically take up Northeast Asia. Sino-US session will be concluded. Thank you to the panelists.
皆様ありがとうございます。
Thank you. This is the end of session 1. We will take a 15-minute break. First of all, Mr. Hideshi Tokuchi, former Deputy Defense Minister, and Professor Osamu Onoda, Advisor to the Toshiba Infrastructure Systems and Solutions, and former Commander of the Air Education and Training Command, Lieutenant General JASDF. The other members will continue on from session 1, and this will be moderated by President Kudo as well. We now begin the final session. Tomorrow we're going to start up the Asia Peace Conference, and that will be participated not only by the United States but our colleagues from China and Korea, and we are working to prepare a multilateral mechanism. But before we launch that conference, we wanted to have a discussion with the United States to talk about peace and stability in this region. As you know, this region is very uncertain at the moment. Rising China and that versus the U.S.-Japan alliance, this confrontation, that has created a certain power balance which is deterring actual war from being waged. But there's high risk of accidental clashes, and there are several hotspots. North Korea, and the other day Taiwan. Election had taken place. That's another flash spot, and Hong Kong. And it's not in Northeast Asia, but there's the South China Sea, and there is no multilateral framework, and there is no confidence-building mechanism. Between the countries in this region, there is no robust, stable bilateral relationship. Japan and China is in pursuit of cooperation, but U.S. and China is in conflict, and there's tension between Japan and the ROK. So the region is very unstable, and as we have already discussed, a variety of risks are on the rise. All the more so because of this context, we need a platform for us to talk with each other, and that's have gained in importance under the current landscape. China, or rather Japan and the United States, should become the core members to exercise leadership in this region in this context for the peace and stability of the region. That's the objective of this session. First, we will ask two lead speakers, Ambassador Yuji Miyamoto from the Japanese side and Ambassador David Shear from the U.S. side. Who goes first? Okay. Ambassador Scheer, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that I think the Indo-Pacific region is experiencing more uncertainty than it has since the United States withdrew from Vietnam in the 1970s. China's rise, President Xi's ambitions, and continued tensions associated with North Korea, Taiwan, and the East and South China Seas are surely among the sources of that uncertainty. But I can't avoid also stating that the United States is also a source of uncertainty these days. President Trump's unpredictability, his wavering commitment to our alliances, his transactional approach to deal-making, all make us wonder what's up with American foreign policy. So I can't predict exactly where the United States is going. I think it'll be important to follow President Trump in the run-up to the American presidential election. That'll be a very important indication. But I want to share with you what I would be advocating to the administration if I were Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific in terms of what the United States and Japan should be doing together to increase stability in the region as well as compete with China. And I'm just going to give you a list of things I think we should be doing. First of all, we should stick to our principles. Those principles should include respect for sovereignty and independence of all nations, peaceful resolution of disputes, free trade and investment based on transparent agreements and reciprocity, adherence to international norms and rules, including freedom of navigation and overflight. And we can't ignore the promotion of liberal political principles because it's a liberal order that we're trying to maintain. That doesn't mean we need to advocate the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party, but continued devotion to liberal principles, I think, is what has to lay at the foundation of U.S.-Japan cooperation. Secondly, I think we need to strengthen deterrence. Strong deterrence is fundamental to all of our efforts. Japan and the U.S. must deploy forces necessary to deter potential Chinese aggression and ensure that we can use those forces in close coordination, as I said earlier, as normal military allies. The relatively new domains of space and cyber cry out for the closest possible bilateral cooperation. It's tempting to believe that we can strengthen deterrence in these domains while trying to formulate peacetime rules of the road on which we can agree with China. Third, we need to develop our diplomatic leverage as well as our future possible military alliances through networking. We should continue building defense and diplomatic networks among our like-minded partners, as with the Quad relationship among the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. We should also be networking at the bilateral and trilateral levels. We tend to think of these as defense relationships, but we need to consider them as diplomatic partnership as well and coordinate more thoroughly on common diplomatic messaging. In this regard, continued bilateral and trilateral coordination among the U.S., Japan, and the ROK is essential. Fourth, we need to cooperate in developing realistic means of managing technology transfer to China. We're not going to be able to cease all flows of technology to China, but the U.S. and Japan should consult closely on how to effectively limit the flow of dual-use technology. Fifth, we need to seize cooperative opportunities with China where they exist. The Obama administration used to define U.S.-China relations as a combination of cooperative and competitive elements. That's still the case, even if our stress will, in the future, be on the competitive elements over the cooperative elements. While we shift the balance toward competition, we can't lose sight of opportunities to cooperate. They exist in the environment, non-proliferation, global health, and disaster assistance, among other areas. Finally, I would be urging, as I said earlier, Japan to increase its defense spending, improve its military capabilities, and devise ways of cooperating more closely with U.S. forces. Let me look at for a minute at some of the hot spots and how we should be handling them under conditions of competition with China. The geopolitical and geoeconomic interests of the U.S. and Japan collide with China's divergent interests along a line of hotspots from the Korean Peninsula to the East China Sea to Taiwan and the South China Sea. The stability of these hotspots, the stability that these hotspots once enjoyed is eroding across the board. In North Korea, Kim Jong-un announced in a December speech that he no longer feels bound by the freeze on nuclear and missile testing. While he has left the door open to continued talks with the U.S., he's also threatened to reveal a new strategic weapon and called on North Koreans to buckle down for the long haul under lasting UN sanctions. I think it's unlikely that Kim will give up his nuclear capabilities, but we have to test this hypothesis through diplomacy while continuing to pressure, deter, and contain the North. The U.S. and the DPRK need to conduct a serious dialogue, and the U.S., Japan, and the ROK need to maintain solidarity through a robust trilateral process. In Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen's commanding electoral victory and the continued demonstrations in Hong Kong surely have shaken Beijing's hope that both territories could be incorporated under the one country, two systems formula. More broadly, public opinion polling on Taiwan indicates that an increasing percentage of the people on the island identify themselves as Taiwanese more strongly than they identify themselves as Chinese. The U.S. has long pursued a double deterrence strategy across the Taiwan Strait. This strategy has consisted, on one hand, of deterring China from using force to reunify with Taiwan, while on the other hand, deterring the people on Taiwan from declaring independence. Under Prime Minister Abe, Japan has strengthened its ties to Taiwan, and I believe this helps give President Tsai not only the confidence she needs to make Taiwan's interest heard by the Chinese, but also to give her the confidence she needs to hold off advocates of independence in her own party. The U.S. and Japan need to signal strongly, continue signaling strongly, that we oppose any effort to change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait by force or by subversion. Japanese and Chinese military and civilian forces continue to confront each other in the East China Sea. Indeed, Kyodo recently reported that Chinese government vessels entered waters claimed by Japan in the Senkakus more than 1,000 times in 2019, which is a record. I think that President Obama's 2014 declaration that the Senkakus fall under the security treaty has limited the Chinese ability to gain advantage in this arena, as have Japanese efforts to strengthen its Coast Guard and move more military assets into the Southwest Islands. It's been argued in Washington that the U.S. shouldn't commit itself to war with China over a few islands. But I think that we are strengthening deterrence in order to promote de-escalation in the situation, and also to ensure that Japan can confidently take the lead in defending its interests in this area. American, Japanese, and Australian naval forces are operating more frequently in the South China Sea as well. The Americans have increased the frequency of FONOPs. The Chinese continue to strengthen the features they occupy in the Spratly Islands and continue to intimidate ASEAN claimants. Last year, the Chinese sank a Philippine fishing boat. They swarmed Philippine-claimed Pagasa Island with maritime militia vessels and harassed a Russian-leased oil rig within Vietnam's claimed EEZ. U.S. military operations in the South China Sea are necessary but not sufficient to demonstrate to the ASEAN claimants our commitment to engaging in Southeast Asia. U.S. and Japanese cooperation in providing quality a quality alternative to Chinese infrastructure projects is a start. But the U.S. has to engage more at the senior-most levels, including presidential or vice presidential participation in the EAS and APEC. With regard to managing competition, I've talked about the need for Japan and the U.S. to strengthen our deterrence. But what about the de-escalatory component of our approach? In addition to points I've made above on what more the U.S. and Japan need to be doing, we also need to refine and intensify efforts to manage risk and reduce tensions. The U.S. and China have already devised methods of reducing strategic mistrust and managing risk. We need to use them, and I think Japan does too. Those methods include bringing our senior-most civilian leaders together as frequently as possible in capitals and on the margins of multilateral meetings elsewhere. Second, building robust military-to-military relations, bringing senior commanders and operators together on a regular basis in an effort to build better communication and transparency. Third, establishing communications channels like the U.S.-China Defense Telephone Link to encourage adequate crisis management between our militaries. And fourth, establishing means by which operators at sea and in the air can behave and communicate in ways that reduce the risk of unintended confrontation in areas heavily patrolled by forces from both sides. Is there more that we can do together? Is there a framework or forum that we haven't tried that could reduce tensions and manage competition across the Strait? I don't think that a board of directors for East Asia or for the Indo-Pacific region is possible. I don't think a Congress of Vienna is possible. I think the U.S. And Japan and China and other of our allies and like-minded countries will have to, as it were, slug it out diplomatically throughout the region on specific issues. Multilateral frameworks are possible, I believe, in specific areas like North Korea with the either 5-party talks, not including North Korea, or ultimately 6-party talks. I think multilateral efforts are possible in risk reduction, such as devising methods of devising rules of behavior at sea. This is something we've worked on bilaterally with the Chinese, and I think it would be useful for Japan to work on that as well. Why don't I stop there and give my colleagues a chance to speak?
ありがとうございました。じゃあ次。
Thank you, Ambassador Miyamoto. Ambassador David Shear, you were very comprehensive. Thank you for that comprehension. You could have skipped my comment, but since I've been given this opportunity, let me add a few points. Ambassador Shear talks about the East Asian security situation. And the biggest uncertainty at the moment is sourced from the United States. So how U.S. responds, that's become unpredictable. And that's become the uncertainty as we try to devise diplomatic policy or security policy. But Japan and the United States must cooperate even more closely for the peace and stability of this region. That recognition is deeply rooted even in Japan as well. Ambassador Shear talked about 2014, President Obama's comment that the Senkaku Islands would be covered by the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. Now, in the situation, the challenge with China began in 2012 already, and it was a disappointment that he didn't say anything until 2014. He could have said it earlier, but at any rate, that explicit comment made it clear that East Asia and Japan and China are part of the landscape. The MOD in Japan has always considered China as a threat, But from the diplomatic perspective, in 1972, with the joint statement, ties were normalized between Japan and China. And the biggest challenge was the Far East clause of the Japan-U.S. Security Pact, that U.S. takes military action in the Far East. What's the border of the Far East? Taiwan is included. That was the official comment. So even after 72 and the normalization of ties with China, the question was whether it's included under the Security Pact. And Japan upholds the position that China is covered. But with Sino-Japanese relations normalizing, how should we interpret the Japan-U.S. Security Pact? And Prime Minister Ohira said, by judging the Japan-China political relationship from face to face, he will think about how the Japan-U.S. Security Pact would be applied. That was an excuse. So diplomatically, that position continued. Japan-China security issue with Taiwan is over how the Japan-U.S. Security Pact is activated. But with 2012 Senkaku incident, Japan's territory must be protected from China, and Japan-U.S. Security Pact became directly relevant in this context. So in our relationship with China, Japan-U.S. Security Pact became necessary for Japan to protect our own territories. So when it comes to East Asia, Japan-U.S. versus China, on the other hand, that kind of landscape became fixed. As the structure becomes fixed, no longer do we have to make a debate on where the border of Far East is. Maybe even in the Indian Ocean, it becomes diplomatically clear that the Security Pact will be exercised in order to protect Japan territory. So that was a dramatic change. So when I say security becomes a pillar in Japan-China relationship is in that context. So security judgment is going to deeply influence the Sino-Japanese relationship. So in this context, naturally, U.S.-Japan alliance is going to become a very important factor in judgment. So in comparison to the past, we have to be even more tilted to the United States than in China. So when we think about region-wide peace and stability, all the more so because of this situation, close consultations between Japan and the United States over security matters is even more necessary. The world at large is in a state of flux. And this transformation and uncertainty will accelerate because of the rise of China, not only economically, but on the military front. So how does East Asia respond to the rise of China? And as you've already said, it's the biggest challenge. So U.S. has its own global strategy. Globally, how U.S. confronts China, and the weight of East Asia in U.S.'s strategy vis-a-vis China becomes heavier. Then, that being said, Japan and the United States will have to liaise more closely than historically, consult with each other to talk how we should be aligned to confront China to ensure the peace and stability of this region. So from such viewpoint, Japan-U.S. alliance resilience has to be further strengthened. That's to the benefit not only for the bilateral relationship, but for our relationship with other Asian countries. Of course, in the short term, there's the issue like crisis management and confidence building, but my biggest concern is Taiwan. The Tsai Ing-wen administration, maybe rather than she making a mistake, Trump administration, as part of the deal with China, What would they do if China takes action that is unacceptable? For example, a port call by Chinese naval vessel to a Taiwan port. When such action is taken that is problematic to Taiwan-U.S. relationship, maybe symbolically China would take such action, then you cannot tolerate and just ignore those actions by China. Then what kind of action? I don't know what kind of action will be taken, but at any rate, military action will have to be taken. And if there's miscalculation between U.S. and China, then that may become elevated to the next stage. So that's the hot spot, Taiwan. It could become extremely peril hot spot in the short term. In the midterm, as Mr. Scheer said, in this region, how do we create discipline? Of course, confidence building and crisis management could be done, but beyond that, if we want to go further to the next step, things are complicated. So how do we define the ultimate goal? What is the end point that we need to achieve? We should begin to discuss with China. Of course, when I say China, with U.S. and Japan on one side and China on the other side. So by having this conversation, what kind of principles would be necessary and what kind of rules are necessary? So those goals ought to be defined. In the end, we will need an international framework in this region. I don't know when that's possible, but until that date, the U.S.-Japan Security Pact will continue to have great importance. I hope that will do for now.
どうも二方
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the two speakers. We don't have that long a time, but nonetheless, we would like to start the discussion. Since we have speakers from the United States, there is a question I would like to ask. Mr. Douglas Paul and Mr. Ralph Da Costa, I would like to hear your takes, your views. My question is, in Northeast Asia, what may be the probability of conflict occurring? What kind of risks would you foresee to happen if you do see some dangers or risks, if you could share with us? And also trying to strengthen the deterrence capability. Of course, as China rises in the region, we need to strengthen our deterrence capability. Ambassador Scheer and others have mentioned Japan's defense expenditures that they must be increased. That was the suggestion. In trying to enhance our deterrence capability, what would you specifically and concretely ask Japan to do? Not only the budget, but of course we need to deal with the missiles that are from China after the INF that has elapsed. And so forth. And as Ambassador Miyamoto has suggested, the biggest risk factor may be Mr. Trump. So that was suggested. So in terms of risks and uncertainties, but we will make public tomorrow when we have asked experts and we have taken a questionnaire. What may be the security risks? Number 3 and number 4 would be what would happen with the presidential election in the United States? Who will be the next president? The Japanese experts are quite worried and concerned over this question. So in a nutshell, Mr. Trump in person may lead to some collapse or destruction. So on these 3 counts, can I ask Mr. Douglas Paul how to start, please?
It's difficult to answer in 3 minutes question that took 5 minutes to ask. But I think the most...
Mic.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. It's difficult to answer in 3 minutes what's been asked in 5 minutes, but I'll make a start.
5分でいいですよ、じゃあ。
No, I'll give you 5 minutes. I'll give you 5 minutes.
To take on a couple of the questions you've posed to us, boss, I think the first most immediate concern is North Korean provocation. The North Koreans have come to the end of their fairly successful diplomacy with President Trump, and they're now quite aware that the U.S. is going into an election year. It's my interpretation of North Korean behavior that the North Koreans believe, Kim Jong-un believes, that Trump has persuaded the American voters that he has brought relative peace and calm to the Korean Peninsula. And yet, Kim Jong-un has not been rewarded with the suspension or elimination of the UN sanctions that are constraining his economy. So he has a very strong incentive to threaten Trump with instability that might damage his prospects for election. That would be the most important value that Trump would seek to protect, and that gives North Korea unusual leverage against the U.S. Because of that, and because of the threats now to deploy a new and unseen weapon, combined with the announcement that diplomacy has come to an end, in effect, I think we've entered a dangerous period. And it's not just that we may have a crisis which will need an immediate response, not just B-52s flying on the coast of North Korea, not just alerts of the troops, but a significant testing of a nuclear weapon or a projection of a long-range missile and some combination of these things, together with an unrelated issue, which is the deterioration of the JCPOA in Iran, where Iran is moving closer to having a nuclear weapon, that the outbreak of proliferation could follow a sequence of crises triggered by North Korea's miscalculation or wrong calculation of the leverage they have over President Trump. That in turn will invite people here in Japan and South Korea and in Taiwan to look at their nuclear options. Now, this takes us to the INF question. A few years ago, I was an advocate of introducing some INF missiles in the range missiles into the region to counter the North Korean new nuclear missile capability. It was a limited thought. I learned in the process that we really don't have missiles to deploy, so that if we were to determine to deploy missiles, and we had cooperation from friendly governments either controlled by the U.S. or allied governments, it would take us 10 years to develop the new weapons. Second, I learned that we already have more than adequate air and sea launched missiles that are not constrained by the old INF treaty and are still available to us to provide a counter to the growing Chinese mid-range missile capability. So the issue is quite complicated, requires very careful technical analysis beyond our impulse. But I think we're on the point of and I won't even go into Taiwan where I could make headlines if you want to today. There's a high potential for a crisis in the Asia-Pacific, Northeast Asian region in the next year or two.
I'm considerably less concerned than Doug is, quite frankly, about potential for conflict. I think there is a great potential for miscalculation or for an accident. I think an accident and a failure to manage that is probably the most likely cause of any kind of confrontation. Particularly North Koreans. The North Koreans are not crazy. They develop nuclear weapons in order to prevent a war, not to start one. During the Fire and Fury period, we spent a year or so pretending that we were going to go to war with one another, which made everyone nervous. For the last year, we've been pretending that there was going to be denuclearization, which made everyone feel good. Now, feeling good is better than feeling nervous, but in both cases, we were pretending. And whether we're going to go back to pretending that we're going to have a war or continuing to pretend that everything is wonderful, when we need to, I think, first of all, stop ever using the word crisis with North Korea unless somebody is actually killed. Instead, use the word provocation, which North Korea is very good at. But the provocations normally stop short of anything that would justify a kinetic response by the United States, and I think they'll continue to act in that way. The second thing we need to do is to stop using the term INF, because the N in the INF is nuclear, and no one is talking about redeploying nuclear weapons to Asia, ground-based nuclear weapons. The problem with INF was that they were neither intermediate nor nuclear, but it would actually cover a broad range. So we probably need to more clearly define what we're talking about. And again, I think the military need to deploy any kind of intermediate range ground-based weapons is suspect, and the political consequences of it are greater. Many of our Korean colleagues tell me they want us to put U.S. tactical nuclear weapons back into Korea. I remember what happened when we tried to put American beef in Korea, and imagine the kind of protests that we would get. It would just give the anti-American element something to rally around. So I think we need to think clearly both the political and the military consequences of any kind of moves like this. Finally, let me say that 2 days before the last presidential election, I was at a dinner in Washington at CSIS, and people at the dinner included Henry Kissinger, Rex Tillerson, et cetera, et cetera. The only person in the room who believed that Donald Trump stood a chance of winning the election in 2 days was my wife. And she said, all you people are reading the Washington Post, none of you are paying attention to social media. And we all sort of tapped her on the head and said, there, little girl, don't worry, we all know better. So anyone who would dare to try to predict who is going to be the next president, or even who the candidates will be at this time is sheer folly. But the one thing that I did learn was not to underestimate Mr. Trump and his political instincts. I'm certainly in the group that would like to see sanity return to our foreign policy. But again, as I mentioned earlier, and let me stress again, when General Kelly was the national security advisor to President Trump, he was asked, how do you respond to tweets? And General Kelly's response was, I don't. I do staff work. When we get a tasker, then we will respond. But if I responded to every tweet, I would just be losing a lot of sleep and spinning my wheels. It's very hard. The one thing that every president in my lifetime understood is that presidents are not entitled to a personal opinion. Mr. Trump believes that he is, and he does that, and the rest of the world is still trying to adjust to a president that tweets out personal opinions that may or may not one day become official U.S. policy, but which sure confuse the hell out of the rest of us, and that's, I guess, just something we're going to have to get used to. Thanks.
さっき名前を一人言う
I forgot to mention someone very important. Mr. Prestowitz, what's your biggest concern and risk for peace and stability in Northeast Asia?
Well, I think my big concern is the South Korea, and I think the fact that South Korea and Japan don't speak to each other, and the U.S. and South Korea don't speak to each other very well, I think is very, very worrisome. And I also think that the Taiwan situation is very important, and that one of the concerns I have about Taiwan is that I'm not an expert, so Doug may have a much better informed view than I do, but I have the sense that Taiwan itself has not provided the strongest defense that it could. I used to live in Switzerland, and Switzerland's a small country, but no one wants to invade Switzerland. It is well defended. I don't have the same feeling about Taiwan. If you think I'm wrong, Doug, say so. But I worry about both of those. But essentially, I come back to the U.S.-Japan relationship because everything hinges on the U.S.-Japan relationship. And while I am very appreciative of what Abe-san has done and of all the efforts that are being made, I would myself, as I said earlier, like to see a larger effort from Japan.
はい。今
Now, we have just heard from 3 American speakers. So, what are the risks for this region? When I listen to them, I do fully understand that they are quite worried. So I would like to ask the Japanese side. Admiral Kawano, are you able to stay? Are you able to stay longer? Okay, then I will give you the opportunity first if you have to leave. So how would you respond to what the American friends have said? I basically agree. Looking at the hotspots, possible hotspots in the region, of course North Korea and China, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan, it is highly risky. Yes, I do fully agree. Now, we were asked to do more in Japan. That was what was proposed from the U.S. Now, just one word on Japan-U.S. security regime. The biggest weakness would be from the U.S. side. From time to time, there are the complaints being heard that it is quite unfair. President Trump's remarks that have been widely reported, and this is a reaction we often hear when something happens, and that is the biggest weakness in the Japan-U.S. security arrangement. And look from the outsiders, they think that Japan and U.S. may not be that close, so perhaps we need to correct the situation. And especially, it's been 60th anniversary for the Japan-U.S. security arrangement, and 4 years prior to that, that was the very origin of the security agreement. My Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Yoshida, that economics come first. And unless that happens, Japan will not be able to have its own defense capability. So for a while, we would have to depend upon the United States on security at the front. And that was the basic thinking behind that. And no self-defense force at all. That was 64 years ago. So the victor and the loser of the Second World War. So that was how the security agreement has started. So the unfairness have already been incorporated into the arrangement. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say the military power, but the self-defense force is now being reinforced. And as Japan has been able to grow in terms of economic power, and the U.S. is on the decline, relatively speaking, so to speak. So Articles 5 and 6, especially Article 5, when contingency happens, the U.S. will help Japan. And Article 6 says that Japan has the obligation to provide the bases in Japan. And the official position is that the 2 articles are well balanced with each other. Back in 1960s, when the U.S.-Japan security agreement was first made public, yes, it was in quite a good balance, but no longer that is the case. So Articles 5 and 6 is in good balance with each other. With that as a premise, yes, Article 5 may be too out proportion, so to speak. Unless we rectify this situation, U.S. will continue to say that it is quite unfair. So that is not good for a U.S.-Japan alliance. So I believe one answer from Japan was the peace and security legislation that we have put forth. But I believe there are something more that we can do. Thank you.
So are you saying that host nation support, but rather than increasing host nation support, defense budget of Japan should be increased? Yes, to enhance our operations. I mean, of course we need to increase defense budget, but at the same time, we need to play more roles in terms of conducting operations. And some argue that there is a balance between Article 5 and Article 6. If you emphasize that Article 5 is staking the lives of the American soldiers, then they will say more balance should be necessary, is necessary. Americans would say. Then Japan would say we will pay more. I mean, that kind of a U.S.-Japan alliance is not a healthy alliance, healthy kind of alliance. In the face of contingency, that kind of relationship, I'm afraid, would not work. So, as I've said many times, the foundation of alliance is a sharing of risks. And SEF officials and American soldiers should share the risks to fight. That is the ground rule for any alliance. Otherwise, we should not forget that.
Thank you very much. Any other Japanese people? Thank you for waiting, Professor Tokuchi. I wasn't waiting, I was listening. But thank you for this opportunity. Having heard what everyone else had said, there are a few points I should like to make. First of all, what Admiral Kano had said was of great importance. U.S.-Japan alliance being asymmetrical. Theoretically, one can conclude that it's balanced. We think so, but an ordinary person, including myself, cannot really consider that it is truly balanced or symmetrical. So Admiral Kawano said sharing the risk. Unless we evenly share the risk, this alliance will not become truly stable. And that was being served as the consultations between Japan and the United States over the roles we play and the obligations and the guidelines. Someone said China isn't mentioned in the 2015 guideline. That's natural. For the sake of discussion, if I say something extreme, China isn't so relevant because Japan's national strength has expanded. It's just a step for Japan to expand its role in that process. So if you try to look at everything only from the lens of U.S.-China relationship, it's not so healthy. But that's the point that I had wished to make. Stick to our principles is what Mr. David Shear had said at the very beginning. That's very important. When we look at that point, building a peace, it's not the peace, it's not building peace, but it's building a peace. Why this a peace? Bad peace is better than right battle, correct battle. But what is the right or correct discipline? I think it's difficult to agree because China has its justice, Japan and U.S. has its justice, and the justice of Japan may differ from that of the U.S. slightly. So where do we find common ground? That's a very complicated issue. And both the United States and Japan is seeking international order based upon the rule of law, rules-based international order, which is a very correct statement, but rules-based order, in principle, that notion is based on the U.S. political system. Dollar is a domestic currency which has become a hard currency in the global market. It's like that. If the credit of the United States goes down, then the trust towards the rule-based order also declines. So, rules-based order, especially on the issue of principles mentioned by Mr. Scheer, we hope that this will also be upheld domestically. That's very important. Talking about Japan, rules-based order, it's not internalized in Japan. In the National Strategy for Security, we talk about rules-based international order, and rules-based international market is a phrase we used, and Genron NPO used the phrase rule-based order. Whatever wording you use, it's not really digestible for an ordinary Japanese reader, so we tend to use the phrase rule-based international order, but it's not been truly internalized. We've been talking about Hong Kong and Taiwan. In Hong Kong, that incident occurred, and it's become quite chaotic, but the U.S. Congress will try to use the majority through the legislature to prevent even presidential veto to be exercised. Even if he vetoes, that could be overcome by U.S. Congress, and that's heightened the trustworthiness of the United States. What about Japan? Did the Japanese Diet do that? No. Everyone's talking about the cherry blossom party, and of course, that's an issue that they ought to be pursuing in time, but that's the only thing they raise. And similar situation in Taiwan. Finally, after the election, the Foreign Ministry issued this comment saying that Taiwan is a very important partner for Japan. That impressed me. Oh, the Japanese Foreign Ministry now goes as far as issuing such comments, but Wolfowitz talked about the Asian Berlin. I asked him where he said that, and he said he forgot the venue where he made that comment, but that's the comment he made. But Taiwan is more important than the Berlin of Asia because USSR never said Berlin is ours, but China is saying Taiwan is ours. So the situation is completely different. So democratization of Taiwan took place more than 20 years ago. So we should place weight on our collaboration with Taiwan. Security Forum in Halifax. From 2 years ago, guests from Taiwan are being invited. Tibetan Uyghur had been invited, not Taiwan, but now, since 2 years ago, people from Taiwan are being invited. Finally, Americans have come that far. But what about Japan, our own country? So stick to principles. That's beautiful, but as a major presumption, in the United States, there are things that U.S. has to do, and in Japan, we have things we have to do. There are many other points that I would like to make, but we don't have time, so I will stop.
Thank you. If we continue, it will go on and on and on, I believe. Now, Admiral Koda, you were silent. You're too silent. As I have listened to the debate, I believe you may have some complaints. So, the press response and Mr. Trump's reaction. Admiral Koda, do you have any complaints vis-a-vis U.S.? Rather than U.S., of course, the biggest complaint of United States is, of course, Mr. Trump. I believe that Mr. Trump is doing 99 out of 100 bad things and just one thing good, which is taking a good policy vis-a-vis China. No U.S. president have not been able to do that. But for the other 99 things, Mr. Trump is doing something very bad. So everyone in Asia is so concerned and worried, especially the treatment of the American allies. Of course, a U.S.-Japan security pact is a big pillar, but for the past 3 decades, U.S. was not able to survive on its own. With the alliances, U.S. have been able to remain being the only superpower after the Cold War. But Mr. Trump, nonetheless, has been negating its allies. Japan is faring better, but the NATO allies such as France and Germany and UK have been treated very badly. I wouldn't try to specialize, but China and Russia and also the Middle East, those questionable countries, when U.S. is trying to address these problems without its allies. Can U.S. alone would be able to tackle these questions? I don't think so. So you need to have more solid cooperation with its allies. That is one thing I would like to say. And of course, there would be political questions, but as ideal, Japan, what can we do to Hong Kong or Taiwan as we try to place importance on democracy and liberty? But we are so reluctant. We are so cowardly. I wouldn't like to say so, but when the U.S. asks something very troublesome to China, and when China reacts badly, and with the Taiwan Relations Act to be instigated, when the U.S. takes actions, what would Japan do? You have to think about that from now. You can't think about this from 10 years from now. So that is the reason why Mr. Kudo says I am a hardliner, a hawk. But I am more cautious, if I may say so. I am rather cautious. And this is a politically sensitive issue, but trying to invoke all sorts of different ideas and wisdom between Japan and U.S., we need to start thinking and plan ahead over Taiwan. When there was a contingency in the Korean peninsula, the self-defense forces have gone on its own. We should not try to close doors and talk secretly, but we should try to have a discussion. When China would attack Taiwan, it would come to the Nansei Islands as well, meaning that for Japan as well, this would be an emergency. Emergency of Taiwan means emergency of Japan. So are you prepared for this? What China do something on Taiwan, it would mean doing something to Japan as well. But if I may dare to ask my friends in the United States, Japan is actually expending defense the budget, which is about 1% of GDP, which is comparable to UK or France. But the UK and France has expenditure over nuclear. So in substance, to be more simplistic, in the Pacific region, there are 2 seventh fleets on the Pacific. And that is what is happening in Asia. There are 7. I don't think there is other navy other than U.S. or Japan of the 55 the vessels on the naval the fleet. In the Pacific region, there is only Japan and the United States who have 350 aircrafts, the bomber, the aircrafts, the fighter planes, that is. On shoulder to shoulder, as Admiral Kawano has said, we should risk our lives together on the battlefield. That is very true. And I also think that we should increase our defense budget. But that is not based upon the unilateral demand from the U.S. But Japan has done a lot. But what about the Taiwan contingency? We need to think about this. We need to think through and discuss with the United States. We that do not have agreement and an alignment, starting from the nuclear and so forth. And many Americans do not really understand what Japan is doing. So we have a capability significantly, but because of the restriction by law, we cannot use a lot of them. But even with the peace and security legislation a few years ago, that is not enough. We should do more so that we can utilize our capability within the U.S.-Japan security agreement and within the realm of trying to defend ourselves. We need to do more.
Maybe I should ask David Shear this following question. The issue of Trump. When I ask questions about Trump, Kudo-san, you're wrong. We are not talking about Trump. We are talking about alliance with the United States, not with Trump. So with or without Trump, there is this bilateral alliance. But it seems that everybody cannot get rid of this Trump issue from their minds. And the issue of increasing defense budget, David Shear, you have high expectations for increased defense budget on the part of Japan to increase deterrence, but for what purpose? For what purpose, in what way Japan should increase its defense budget, in your view? Host nation support will come to a deadline in 2021 March. So the negotiation will have to start between Japan and the United States. And Trump is asking Japan to increase by 3 times or 5 times. So how should look at this demand, which is likely coming from the United States?
First, on the subject of Japanese defense spending, I'm less concerned about an increase in the Japanese defense budget in order to pay for host nation support. I agree with Admiral Kawano that the best test of the U.S.-Japan alliance is the extent to which both sides are willing to share risk. And in order for Japan to share risk more effectively with the United States, they need the defense capabilities that can allow them to do that. I think also it was mentioned in our private session earlier today that one thing that should be happening is not just strengthening of the alliance, but a stronger Japanese role in the region as a middle power. It was stated in our earlier session that middle powers will need to step up, not just Japan, but others as well, including Australia. And in order for Japan to play the most effective possible role in the region as a middle power, I think it will need to show the region that it has the will to increase its defense budget and throw off the self-imposed shackles on the use of the military tool in statecraft.
わかりました。会場からの質問
Thank you very much. We've collected questions from the floor, but I forgot my glasses. I read. Masuda-san of the National Defense Academy or National Defense Research Institute, you have 2 pairs of glasses, so please read. He was to attend as a panelist, so let him contribute in that way because he didn't get to speak as a panelist. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Masuda. This is not my question, by the way. 3. I will select 3 questions, judging from the flow of conversation, and especially to Tokuchi-san. There's one question. Tokuchi-san and Koda-san. Taiwan was mentioned. What would you think would be the desirable military relationship with Taiwan? And Admiral Koda, you mentioned Japan-U.S. Alliance be prepared for crisis, but what about Taiwan? So that's the question to two of you. And I think this is a question to Mr. Doug Powell. To begin with, U.S. or Trump administration in East Asia, can it maintain its commitment in East Asia? Most recently, the Iran issue has popped up, or will the United States become preoccupied with the Middle East, so much so that they cannot maintain commitment to East Asia? Do you think that America's commitment to East Asia can be upheld? Lastly, I think this is a question to Professor Takahara. For example, U.S.-China tension and conflict, the source may be values or regime and system. Then in what form can we try to coordinate such fundamental issue, and what can Japan do in that context? Thank you. Thank you. So what are we supposed to do? I'll leave it up to you. And Onoda-san, please be brief. Oh, sorry. I forgot. Sorry. You are such a heavy-weighted person, and I didn't realize. I just have two short points. One, when we think Japan-U.S. cooperation in a positive way, the weakest point of China is that it has to maintain the legitimacy of the administration, and that the administration will never be erroneous, because if they admit that the administration can also make mistakes, that it will mean collapse. That's the weakest point. What can we do then in this context? China is causing many incidents and accidents, and with transparency we can communicate that information to the world. November 13th, 2013, in East China Sea, the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, was identified by China and Japan, and the United States was vehemently against ADIZ being defined. Unless you obey the Chinese military authorities and fly over, then some action will be taken. Those wordings were included, and Senkaku was identified as China's territory. So those were the two contentious points, and this caused debate. And then China flew fighter planes, and in the Senkaku Islands took action. But that was exposed and became quite prevalent and caught the attention, and that then calmed down the situation, and China became quieter. So, and ever since, in South China Sea, United States opened all information they received, including video about actions being taken by China, and it's already been proven by taking these measures we can change the behavior of China. So maybe Japan and United States can more closely cooperate along those lines to assert openness and transparency and upgrade the level of transparency from the perspective of crisis management in our relationship with China. That's my first point. Second point is negative. You mentioned the increase of defense spending, Ambassador Scheer. I used to be with the Self-Defense Force, and I do agree that there's high necessity to increase defense spending, but we're on the same boat but watching different dreams, because the midterm defense program was identified most recently, and it was mentioned that in defense budget you front or take in upfront the next fiscal year's budget, and then the next fiscal year's budget, and it snowballs. What that means is the budget is in short. Even if we want to invest in devices and equipment, we have to we have to borrow money the previous fiscal year, and because we don't have funds, you have to pay in installments. So we cannot avoid increasing the defense budget. But another point, we buy equipments from the United States because high performance U.S. Equipments have to be purchased. That's the reason for snowballing, and they are prohibitive. It depends on the equipment, but it's sometimes 1.5 or twofold the normal price. It's like them doing really, really profitable, lucrative business and taking too much profitability. But there has to be a very strong defense-to-defense cooperation and also more information. Now there's this initiative to share outer space information, and the self-defense force will make investments to purchase radar and cooperate with the space forces of the United States. But even if we want to share information, all the technology, U.S. will not provide all of the technology. So we have to purchase everything from the United States, have the Americans teach us how to use it, and then operate. And no technology transfer to the Japanese defense industry. And that trend will accelerate. It could be partly understood because of a problem of technology leakage to China. But at least we're allies. So even at the equipment level or technology level, can't we more positively share information, or else this kind of cooperation cannot be sustainable?
じゃあ
Thank you very much. Then going back to the previous question, that we are running out of time, and please be mindful of the time. Now, very briefly on Taiwan. Between Taiwan and mainland China, the armed conflict, I don't think that would happen soon. I don't think that would happen anytime soon. But in the past, compared to what used to be between Taiwan and mainland China, the communication channels also seem to be closing up. So mishap could happen or accident could happen because of that. And that could lead to a big armed conflict. I cannot deny that possibility. Now, looking at the Japan-China relationship today, within Chinese policy, in terms of security, I believe we could have a cooperation over the Taiwan question, and we should do that. On the other hand, if we do it blatantly, then China may react. How would China react? Would it be vis-a-vis Taiwan or vis-a-vis Japan? Perhaps China may actually impose more pressure on Taiwan. That is not desirable. So we should go about quietly if we are to provide assistance or cooperation with Taiwan. But there are many things we can do. Even so, looking at the reality in Taiwan, we need to listen carefully to what Taiwan has to say, what are their needs. And we try to have a good management. And Taiwan has a great expectation over Japan, especially to Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force, and they have big complaints. I have been meeting with the high level of the people in Taiwan last year and the year before last. I have heard complaints, but there are things we can do and things we cannot do. So having good management at a certain level and quietly, we should have consultation with Taiwan. And ultimately, we should be able to have a contingency planning. Because if something happens in Taiwan Straits, the United States would have to utilize their forces, the base in Japan. So at least between Japan and Taiwan, maybe not as far as contingency plan, but with that in mind, we need to have serious discussion with Taiwan. and also with the United States over the Taiwanese question as well.
ありましたよね。
Takahara-san, I know you wanted to speak. Well, the set of values of the Chinese and the values upheld by the United States and Japan, I mean, there are differences, but the fact that there are differences is not necessarily an issue, because the Chinese set of values has been the same since 1972. But the value of values of believed in by Chinese has not become an issue when it comes to bilateral relations between Japan and China. Instead, with the rising national power of China, and China can now exercise more influence over other countries, and that I believe is a more important issue. That China has now has a capability to influence the regimes outside China. Political regimes outside China. Dr. Xie talked about the importance in protecting the principle of liberty, freedom, and rights, human rights. I believe it is important for us to safeguard these set of values. At the same time, but we need to use diplomatic techniques. Sovereignty is also the case. A good example is Myanmar in recent months. Because of the Rohingya problem, there are a lot of criticism against Myanmar because Myanmar, according to the critics, Myanmar has been violating the rights of Rohingya, and that pushes Aung San Suu Kyi closer to China. So it's not simple. And when it comes to China, I believe the China will change sooner or later. So while we wait for the change in China, we have to preserve peace in this region, and their alliance could play a significant role. But one thing that has not been mentioned by our colleagues is, I'm not an expert in security, national security, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I tend to believe that asymmetric alliance it could be difficult to manage. So I'm rather place so much appreciation for the efforts that have been made to maintain and safeguard this asymmetric alliance between Japan and the United States for so many years. And we are talking about a completely different country. United States has global perspectives, and Japan may have a strategy, but its strategy is confined within the region. Therefore, there are divergence. And when there is a divergence in terms of priorities between Japan and the United States, how to manage the alliance, that is a very important, difficult issue. The United States has changed its strategic priorities, and now United States, China is the biggest, the highest priority. But so we now have an alignment between Japan and the United States, but this could change in the future again, and we might see divergence in terms of the strategic priorities between Japan and the United States, and we should be prepared for that.
Thank you very much. I think there was a question to Dr. Douglas Paul too, right?
On the question of U.S. durability in East Asia, this is an issue that troubles me greatly. I've written a long piece earlier last year. I really believe that we can adapt to the change in structural arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region and maintain a leading and an important role in the region while still accommodating the growth of Chinese power and influence in the region and trying to shape that power and influence through our friendships and alliances in the Asia-Pacific region. It's been frustrating to look since President George W. Bush in 2001 talked about China as a strategic competitor, and he thought he would apply resources to dealing with China. He was quickly distracted after 9/11, and we're now in the longest war of our history in Afghanistan. We've had disappointments in Iraq, and we're still there. And President Obama announced that he wanted to pivot or shift to the Asia-Pacific region in 2011, but he could never get himself out of the quicksand of the Middle East. And Trump himself came in arguing that we should end the endless wars and get our forces redirected elsewhere. And still he has not been able to do it. So there's been a gap between our aspirations and our accomplishments, but I think if we can match those up we're quite capable of providing the kinds of resources and political cooperation and leadership with our colleagues in the Asia-Pacific region to accommodate the rise of China while not submitting to the dominance of China in this region. Thank you.
はい、はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. The second session, we have very heated debate at more than 1 hour. But last comment, Ambassador Miyamoto, are you okay? Then we would like to close the discussion for now. Looking at the order and peace in this region, the role to be played by Japan-U.S. alliance is very important. But in order to enhance and improve on the alliance, there are things that we can do more. So we have been able to affirm on that. Based upon that, tomorrow we will launch the Asia Peace Conference. So people in the audience, if possible, I hope that you will be able to join us tomorrow as well. I would like to thank especially the panelists. Thank you very much.
パネリストの皆様、誠にありがとう。
I would like to thank also our panelists. With this, we would like to bring to a close our dialogue between the United States and Japan. Please join me in giving the panelists a big round of applause.